We're joined now by two top pollsters, Margie O'Mara, president and founder of Momentum Analysis, a Democratic public opinion research firm, and Frank Luntz, a Republican pollster, president of Luntz Global, and he's recently conducted focus groups with senior voters. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
All right, Frank, let's begin with you. Could older voters determine who wins the White House and control of Congress this year?
I think it's more than they could. I think they will. And the question that I'm looking at are those who actually meet the ARP definition, people 50 to 64. In fact, if you asked me to focus on the 5-year voting block, 60 to 64-year-olds, they turn 60, they don't have the retirement savings they need, they didn't plan for the future, they suffered a lot over the last 3-4 years. They're nervous about Medicare, nervous about Social Security, and those voters are up for grabs.
So, Margie, is this the year where older voters are the prize voters, the decisive voters?
Well, I think any year, any close election, every group has a chance of being the group that's going to decide the election. And I think seniors absolutely have been a group that Democrats have been struggling with over recent years. So we have some work to do to bring them back. And I think they should be scared about their Medicare and their Social Security, given what's happening in Congress right now, where you have Republican Congressman Paul Ryan trying to introduce a bill to a budget that would make it much more difficult for seniors and people who will be seniors soon to get the Medicare benefits that they have been counting on.
We're going to get to, because obviously that's one of the big issues. What, you want to respond to that one quickly?
Yes, because actually his legislation is explicit. And I give them credit because it's a good scare tactic, and in the work that I've done, it does work politically. No one over age 55 would be affected in the least. Zero impact. Anyone over age 55 for Medicare in Paul Ryan's budget.
What we do want to get to is what the seniors are viewing about these proposals and about those issues. But first, let's break down these segments, because I think that is also very important, that we can't see it as just one big block. So let's sort of break it down, let's say, between 50, 64 boomers versus, 65 plus. So when we're looking at the segments and party affiliation or how they tend to vote, what's your message on that, Frank? What do you see in the polling?
And there's actually 3 segments. There's the 55 to 64, the pre-retirees, 65 to 74, who are still not retiring.
All right.
Because you now have a significant percentage to work into their 70s. And then basically it's really 72 and above, because at that point you are retired.
Okay, and so that's how Frank breaks it down. So give us how they how do they relate to the parties?
Now, they have been more partisan than younger voters because they grew up in a more partisan era, but they are willing to switch their vote if they think that their programs are being threatened, such as Social Security and Medicare. And now, for the first time, the deficit and the debt have become a serious issue to them, because they are altruistic and they don't want to see their children and grandchildren suffer because Washington cannot control spending.
Margie, how do you see the breakdown in terms of the age segments? I mean, in terms of how they relate to the parties? I mean, is it fair to say that boomers are becoming more Republican versus the greatest generation, which was more Democratic? And where do you break that? Do you agree with sort of Frank's numbers, how we should look at these segments?
I think there's a lot of sense to what Frank is saying. I think there's two other considerations. First, if you look at older voters, they tend to be more conservative on some social issues, and I think that may play a role in this election. And then the other thing that I think is important, and it's not just seniors, it's everybody, is looking at folks who are taking care of an elderly relative. I mean, I almost didn't make this interview today because I take care of my 85-year-old dad who fell in the bathroom and I had to take him to the emergency room. And so people would think that I may not care about senior issues because I'm not a senior.
Right,
but
a very important point.
So it's important to look, and a lot of folks in that 50 to 60 range are going to be maybe taking care of their parent or of a brother or of a neighbor. So a lot of those issues of independence and helping seniors stay independent and in their own home are going to be huge issues for people across the age groups.
Does the trend, though, tend to favor Republicans this year, do you think, if we're talking about older voters generally being more conservative?
But I agree that there are different things that are pulling at it. So depending on what the issues are that they're focused on in the last 3 weeks may determine who wins and who loses. Socially, they're more conservative. They absolutely are concerned about Social Security and Medicare. Now have this deficit and economic concerns. You can't call it. You just can't.
Wow.
I saw one poll recently that showed seniors twice as concerned about Social Security and Medicare as jobs, which, if you look at most polling nationally, jobs, it's just jobs, and then everything else is a distant second, third, and fourth. But for seniors, a lot of them are far more concerned about Social Security and Medicare than any other economic issue.
And I'll add one more to that, which is prices. Gas prices for those that still drive. electricity prices, healthcare prices. The cost of life is a significant issue to seniors, many of them who are on a fixed income. That is rising and rising and rising. As we tape this, it's the number 2 issue. By the time this airs, this may be the number 1 issue.
All right. Let's listen to what some people on the street that we talked to here in Washington, but also at the villages in Florida, what they had to say about some of the issues important to them. Let's take a listen.
I'm really concerned about the economy and the national debt.
Okay. Elaborate a little.
Well, it's got to be fixed. No elaborating. We got to quit spending money.
The most important issue to be talked about is the housing, the no jobs, and the Social Security.
And one word, jobs.
Most important issue, I would believe, is our troops that are over there still. I'd like to see them all come home.
Social Security should still be available, but because we all live longer, that we should pay in longer. So if we were paying until we were 65, now pay until we're 70 or 72.
I don't know anybody who doesn't like Social Security and Medicare. My parents are on it. I think the problem is it's not possible to sustain it for me, and it's not possible to sustain it for my kids.
I'm not really concerned about cuts while we still have a voting power. I'm worried for my children.
All these easy answers that we hear in the campaign, we just got to take that with a grain of salt, because nobody's going to vote Social Security out. They won't be able to get voted in. And nobody backs the Americans of death to support it, because then they won't get voted in.
All right, so let's start with Social Security and Medicare. Again, we want to focus on what the polling or what the focus groups are showing as it relates to those 2 issues. Frank, go ahead.
By 2 to 1, the public does not want to see cuts to either program. And yet by 2 to 1, they believe that if nothing is done, then these programs will continue to get weaker financially, and particularly Medicare goes over. Everyone knows that we're living longer. Everyone knows that the percentage of people that are entering the retirement age is growing by huge amounts because of...
We talk about that many times on this program.
And
right?
yet, the numbers don't work.
Let me ask you about messaging, because both of you guys specialize in your words to use, words not to use. Are there certain words this year, if you were advising a candidate, you would say, don't use that word, whatever you do? It's a loser word.
There's lots of words that I say are loser words. I mean, any kind of, I'll give an example. I mean, if you get too far in the weeds in terms of policy nuance, it just becomes hard for people to follow and pay attention. So there was an example during one of the Republican debates where Mitt Romney was trying to talk about his own wealth and doing it badly, and he kept talking about entities, and it just seemed like such a process kind of word to use to talk about what you own and what you have. And so that's an example of one of just where you're getting too far.
I want to do what they wanted, which is no excuses. Stop making excuses that it's this side, or the House, or the Senate, or the President. Stop making excuses. Get it done.
Mm-hmm. So you think clear messaging is what...
That is focused on solutions and focused on results, not this back-and-forth politics.
Well, I mean, look, and I agree. That's what people want. That's why focus groups, doesn't matter what age group, what gender, where you are in the country, people say, let's have compromise, let's work together. And it may sound like a Democratic talking point, but it's the Tea Party and some of the extreme folks in the House who have really gone to the cause, huge crisis, partisan bickering, have
what do we know
gone
about older voters and
screaming at
constituents?
I mean, that's the kind of behavior that people really hate.
All right, so let's talk about the battleground states, especially as it relates to older voters. Where older voters do you think could make the difference? So, Frank, where are the states to watch that where seniors are going to be the tipping point?
We'll obviously agree on Florida because it's so many electoral votes, because it will decide the presidential race by 2 points in either direction. And that's why one of the reasons why I think Marco Rubio is a leading candidate on the Republican side for vice president.
Mm-hmm.
He's only 40, and yet he has an appeal. He won his race by, 20 points over? There was a Republican, a former Republican who ran against him, and a Democrat. So in a 3-person race, he won by almost 20 points, or about 20 points. I think he would help. Then the other states, and I'll choose 2 that are traditionally Democrat but could go Republican, which would be Michigan, because of the economic collapse. And while Detroit has started to come back, they elected a Republican governor, a Republican House, a Republican Senate, added 2 Republican members of Congress. It was the single biggest turnaround, the single biggest loss for Democrats in 2010 of any state in America. And so you've got to look at it as being different in 2012. And the other state, we'll see what happens, is Pennsylvania.
All right, Margie, what's on your list to watch in terms of older voters?
Sure. Well, there are a couple states where there's large groups of retirees in Arizona and North Carolina. Arizona went Republican last time because John McCain was on the ballot, so now it's going to be much more of the battleground state.
You see it as up for grabs?
Yes, I see it as up for grabs. North Carolina went for Obama. We'll see if that holds, if he can hold that state this time around. And it's a state where there have been a lot of retirees moved down there too.
And
Nevada, I know you want to also mention
Nevada as well, right?
Okay.
Nevada as well. I mean, Nevada, is one of those states where it's had some economic high unemployment, which plays a role, larger Latino population, and very transients moving in and out all the time. So we'll see how that evolves.
If Arizona goes for Obama, if North Carolina goes for Obama, Obama's definitely reelected. Yeah. If either Pennsylvania or Michigan go for the Republican, then the Republican's elected. So there's interesting.
Do you agree on that? I think that's right, yeah.
Okay. Wow, we have some agreement here.
So we should end it right now.
But we won't, of course, we won't, because I do want to ask you, are you seeing any gender differences among older voters in terms of either issue importance or party affiliation identification?
Well, I think there's a gender difference, a gender gap, in that women are going to be lean more Democratic, and that holds true across age groups, and that's going to be true with seniors. It's true with younger voters. It's true across the board, where women tend to be more Democratic, and that's why it's key. Women voters are key to Democratic successes. It's why, in my view, Republicans have really had a lot of missteps recently in what they're doing with women voters. Maybe that doesn't affect seniors or doesn't hurt them with seniors as much necessarily, but it does add to this dynamic where one party is seen as more on the side of women and one party isn't.
But the gender gap, the older that it gets, actually the less significant it gets. That the gender gap is much bigger among voters 40 and under than it is among voters 60 and older. And I think
so in other words, older men and women, you're saying, tend to vote more alike.
They're more alike than the younger. But there is still a difference.
Still a difference. Okay.
And the priorities are different, and their willingness, and it's because they grew up in a different time. And it's hard to explain to someone who's 35 what it was like to grow up during the Vietnam War and to watch these casualty figures every single week on television. And there's a greater support for defense issues among older men than there is older women. Women are more focused on Medicare and Social Security than older men are, because older men are looking more towards the future.
Yeah, thank you so
and women are far more likely to be careful, parts of my earlier point about that.
So just quickly on this, could this be the first time that 50-plus voters will be the majority of the votes cast? Are we looking at that? Are we there yet?
I don't know. I mean, it's going to depend. Obviously, seniors are reliable in terms of voting. It's also going to depend on younger voters and how engaged they are to come to the polls and whether it can approach the record turnout levels from 2008.
And the problem is going to be the negative ads. It's going to be awful. Whatever we've seen in the last few months, it's just going to get so much worse.
Who gets swayed more by negative ads, older or younger voters?
Older voters hate it more.
Well, saying you hate it is not necessarily the same as not voting because of it or changing your mind because of them, and not all negative ads are created equally.
But that's one of the things that older voters don't like, is the defense of negative ads. I wish
well,
that
then let's get rid of Citizens United and super PACs and change all that.
I wish that we could have an election where 80% of the messaging isn't "my opponent stinks." That 80% of it was focused on what you believe and why, and what those results will be. I'm just not optimistic that that's going to happen this time.
That's going to happen. And thank you both for coming in, two award-winning posters. We really appreciate it.